56 years ago today, an event took place that forever changed the course of our nation's history. It was a day when Malaysians turned against each other with a fury not seen before or since. A state of emergency was declared, Parliament was suspended. It was a catastrophe that led Tun Dr. Ismail, the Minister of Home Affairs, to declare, "There is no doubt now that democracy is dead in this country." I remember the time well. I had just enrolled as a freshman at the University of Malaya. It was a time of 24-hour curfews, of murder and mayhem, of great political upheaval and chaos. Hundreds of people lost their lives. Families were forever scarred. Thousands of people became refugees. Mass arrests took place. Thousands left Malaysia for good. Some 75% of Malaysians were born after May 13, 1969 and appear to have little or no knowledge of what really happened that day. It has receded into history, save for the scars that remain in the hearts of those who lost friends and family members in the riots. But whether we know it or not, May 13 still exerts a powerful influence on our nation. So many of the policies and laws that affect us today can be linked to May 13th. It continues to inform our politics and impact race relations. And of course, our politicians still invoke the memory of what happened 56 years ago to intimidate and stifle criticism. May 13th is the bogeyman of Malaysian politics. My guests today to talk about all this are Dr. Kua Kia Soong, social activist, former MP, and author of a seminal study on May 13th. Dr. Munirah Alatas, a renowned academic, columnist, and currently Deputy Director at the Center for Governance, University of Malaya, and Syed Akbar Ali, a prolific author, former banker, newspaper columnist, outspoken political commentator, and of course, blogger of Outside the Box fame. Welcome to Straight Talk. Let's get started. May 13th was a defining moment, certainly the most violent episode in our nation's history. So I thought maybe we can begin by looking at the situation, the political situation in 1969. So can you shed some light about what was going on in 1969 that led up to the outbreak of violence? Maybe we can start with you, Soon.
Okay. That election, 69 election, was certainly the most very sensitive one, and it was a historic one, because for the alliance had been in power all that time, and for once the opposition was quite strong, and the result of the election proved that it was correct. You know, well, the important thing was that the two-thirds majority of the alliance was broken, and the opposition was going to take control of Perak and Selangor. Penang was also taken until Gerakan got into power, and Kelantan had fallen to PMIP. So it was a very
a watershed moment.
Completely, you know, and you can see everybody was on tenterhooks about the election results.
And then soon after that, violence broke out. And there was a horrific orgy of killing. What do we know about how it started, where it started, and the extent of the violence? I mean, was it nationwide? I understand it was just confined to KL, basically.
Well, basically, I think it was, the myth is that it was spontaneous, that it suddenly happened among the public, and that, you know, the politics angle of it was downplayed. And it probably is still the message. It's the myth that is being promoted. But you know, as we know, a book that was published recently, maybe 2 years ago, called Life After, It is an oral history of
Yes.
exactly of
I
what.
want to come to that. I have a copy of that book here.
I see.
But,
Okay.
but can we look at the extent of the violence? I mean, what really happened? What numbers are we talking about?
Well, the official, I mean, Soong, you might know.
Yeah, the
more.
official numbers are 196 killed and quite a few wounded.
How were they killed?
There was, slashing with parang, and then there were people killed with guns.
The majority were the majority killed gunshot wounds?
First of all, there was never there should have been an open inquiry by the National Operation Council, but that was never done. If that had been done, we would have had records, hospital records, which was very, very important at that time. Then the Red Cross was also very active at that time. So if you had the hospital records and the Red Cross records, you would have figured out who were killed, how many were killed, how they were killed, etc., etc. And it's shocking that after all these years, because you know how hospital records are destroyed after about 5 or 10 years. If they were not destroyed, we would have gone to the bottom of this and know who were killed and how many were killed. But that was not done. So after all these years, we still don't really know how many were killed, who were killed.
I think from the foreign correspondence, we do have an idea that who the majority of the deceased were, the killed. So we can corroborate that kind of evidence. Of course, we will only know for sure once the OSA is lifted off the government documents, which probably, I don't know if we'll live to see that happen, but this is the only way to know exactly the data, to get the accurate data. And that's necessary. For many reasons it's necessary.
May I backtrack a little bit? Maybe can I start with my conclusion, will it happen again?
We'll come to that.
Okay, yeah. So you see, I look at it, I was 9 years old when May 13 happened. This is 2025, 56 years have gone by. So if you look at the passage of time, 56 years have gone by. In less than half of that time, 24 years, 24 years before 1969 was when the Japanese were occupying Malaya, 1945. And then we had just become independent in 57. So the country was still new. People were, the word is out like this, unsettled. We're not sure. So many things happened. We have to bear in mind that May 13 happened in 1969. But 2 years before, there was massive racial riots in Penang,
Indeed.
the Hartal of 1967, which today, if you go to Penang and ask any person, even our age, nobody knows. And don't forget, 20 years before that, 1946, Johor, there was the well-known clashes in Batu Pahat, which lasted a while and claimed a lot of lives, which was a direct result of the end of the Second World War. There were grievances and all that, people accusing each other of collaboration, things like that. So there was a history of racial, well, I would call it flare-ups. My view, I read your books, my view is that I look at it as these things happen in our history. They are isolated in time and in location. Some of these were relevant to a particular location because it didn't flare up throughout
Localized,
everywhere.
in other words.
And at that time only, because May 13, within a few months after May 13, Chowkit was back to normal.
But the point you made about most Malaysians don't know, I came across this figure that 75% of Malaysians were born after 1969. But Soong, I want to refer to this particular book, which I would highly recommend. I think all Malaysians should read this book. But in this book, you make the rather shocking assertion, and I want to quote from this book, that it says, "The records show without doubt that the riots of May 1969 were carefully planned and organized, and that they were an excuse for the new regime to declare an emergency to effect regime change." You obviously did a lot of research, and I understand you went through the records from the British archives and things like that. But what evidence did you discover that led you to this conclusion?
That's interesting, because when I was doing my PhD, I already did my work at the Public Records Office in Kew Gardens. And that was 77 to 78 I did my PhD thesis. I was 27, 28 years old. And at that time, I already had some kind of idea of how it was. But let's look at the time of 77. 77 was the time when Subki Latif, a very well-known past intellectual at that time, had written, he had gone to Singapore, with ISEAS, in South Asian Affairs. He wrote an article in there with the same conclusion. And then there were others. Tunku, I've got the Tunku tapes, and I published the Kedas and Tunku tape. Kedas was going to be the official biographer of the Tunku. And Tunku, in the tape, said as much. It's published in my book. Harun was one of those, and he says Mahathir, Ghazali, Shafi, etc. So he actually, Tunku also knows. And from the records that I found, it was also, in fact, Lee Kuan Yew in 1969 said as much as well, when the country had been taken over with an state of emergency, and Raza and control, with the army and the police behind him. But so that was a very good evidence of a.
Others have come to the same conclusion. Professor Jomo has said the same thing. Tan Sri Tommy Thomas, in his book Justice in the Wilderness, made the same reference. And I think that even, as you say, even Tunku Abdul Rahman later on, at first he blamed the communists and the communalists and the opposition, but later on admitted, came to the conclusion that there was a deliberate attempt to overthrow him. But I want to understand, are you saying that, or suggesting, based on what you have uncovered, are you suggesting that the whole May 13 was planned right from the get-go, the word get-go, or did disturbances break out and certain people then use that as an opportunity to effect regime change?
No, the important evidence was the way in which these hoodlums,
the mob,
gathered at the Menteri Besar's house, and that the hoodlums came from further afield.
I think it was. Excuse me, Soong. Just to add on, I think an important issue is the crisis within the alliance itself. There was this factions within, in terms of the Tunku, the need or the desire for Tunku to step down. He agreed, but then there was no date that was specified. So there was this conflict, internal conflict going on. So I think, Soong, you can continue about the mob gathering at the Menteri Besar's house. And
yeah, that was clear from the evidence, and actually the foreign correspondence reports at that time also corroborated that, and one of the local press was suspended, of course, but that was the evidence, and there's amply corroborated.
There was a lot of politics involved. Just after the elections, emotions were high and things like that. About the communists, there was an insurgency going on. There was an active shooting war going on against the government. In 1946, there was involvement of communist elements in stirring up trouble. All this can be debated, but this was what people were discussing at the time. Even in Penang, there were elements of unions and other groups, organized groups, who were influential in just fanning up issues. It is difficult to say that in 1969 that the communists ceased fire and entirely pulled back. They are fighting a war against the government.
But didn't the Tunku himself
discredit eventually? But I find it quite difficult to say that the communists totally didn't take advantage.
Because at one time, I think Tunku and others in the NOC made the assertion that Communist China at the time was actually supporting, sending funds and trying to. But then Tunku himself, in the end, agreed that they were not
not
involved.
just the Tunku.
Ghazali Shafi as well.
Ghazali Shafi as well as
Yeah,
Ismail.
I don't know whether this was like, planted up. I remember in those days, when I was 9 years old, there were red flags, in Ipoh. People plant here, there, and then they're going to remove it, stuff like that. So people, I don't know, they were taking advantage. Various parties, whatever was their politics, there was chaos going on in the country, and maybe they thought they could, take advantage. So it's really difficult to put a finger on anything or not to put a finger on anything.
But I think maybe what you're referring to about flags being able to see.
People who are agitating.
Yes, there might be pockets of that happening, but as a movement, as a communist movement to overthrow them.
As a historian, you're going to find out the causes of the riot, of this so-called riots. You can't just use those evidence as because it's very, very important. Like I said, if the Home Minister himself can say, definitively that it wasn't the communists.
Yeah.
Then you can't just say, oh, and there was this and there was that.
But the other point, which from what you said earlier, is that it was quite localized. It was basically a KL thing, Chowkit and Kampung Baru, and certain urban centers along the west coast, Penang, of course, and Malacca, a few other places. But you talk to people like from Kelantan and Terengganu.
Yes.
There was basically.
But can I take up that point? The fact that it was localized. As you yourself pointed out, there were riots in Malaysia before 1969, 1990,
and they were all localized.
They were all localized. The Penang was just Hatal. Yeah.
People in Ipoh didn't know anything about it.
I'm from Bukit Mertajam, and I remember the troops in Bukit Mertajam.
Yeah.
May 13th, I just enrolled in the University of Malaya. But there was a history of it, and given the fact that the riots in Kuala Lumpur were also localized, and yet you have this sequence of events that followed this particular one, not earlier one, where a state of emergency was declared, where the constitution suspended.
That's the important part.
Yeah, and I think that lent credence.
That could be the political part.
But
the coup d'etat. The coup d'etat part.
Yes.
Yeah.
Taking up from what you just said about about Parliament being suspended and the emergency, law and order was established 2 to 3 weeks, maybe at the most 4 weeks later after the
July.
Okay, why was the Magiran extended all the way till 1971?
That's the politics. That's the coup d'etat.
Well, the point is that it is a very significant issue to take note of. Why? Because there were internal.
So was the Magiran, from what you said earlier, Doctor, planned before, or is just something that they cooked up along the way? You see.
Did they take advantage?
Did they take advantage
of the writing to implement?
Were they trying to pivot or leverage on what had already happened, or was it already pre-planned? This is what it's difficult to, which you can debate.
Of course, it's difficult because it goes back to the fact that the actual documentation is still under the OSA.
But I want to move on.
Yeah, okay.
I want to move on. There's an interesting quote from Tun Dr. Ismail in this book by Wiki Beng, The Reluctant Politician. Another book which I think that all Malaysians should read. But there's a quote in that book in which he says, Tun Dr. Ismail took what he called the ultras to task, accusing them of believing, and I'm quoting, believing in the wild and fantastic theory of absolute dominion by one race over the other communities, regardless of the constitution. He also admitted that polarization had taken place in Malaysian politics, and that, again I'm quoting, extreme racialists among the ruling party, meaning UMNO, are making a desperate bid to topple the present leadership. And of course, they were accusing Tunku of being too pro-Chinese and of neglecting to defend Malay rights. So my question is, was this the beginning of the whole concept of Ketuanan Melayu?
Like I said, within the first week of May 13, by the end of the second week, by the end of the first week, beginning of the second week, Raza was already in control. And the NEP and the NCP, then Ghazali Shafi is put in charge of the NCP, which is education policy, cultural policy. And by the second week, this was already in running. So So that plan was implemented right from the start.
What plan?
This plan to have a so-called Malay agenda, you know, the new economic policy, the amendment 8A to the Article 153. You know, people are always talking about, you know, Article 153 and that kind of stuff. But the important point is that in 1971, it was amended with an 8A, which brought in the quota system, etc., which is very different from Article 153 of 1957. So these are things that went into operation right from the second week of May 13. So it wasn't as if, you know, the events took control of things. They had already planned.
I recall an interview by Tun Musa Hitam. He was in KL at the time. I listened to his interview. He spoke at some in-depth, but at face value what he said. They were taken by surprise, and they were totally at a loss what to do that night. They were totally at a loss what to do, and they were calling each other and trying to sort things out. It didn't look like they were part of that plot that you're mentioning. I mean, the planning. They just didn't know. Then things took their own momentum, and then I think the coup began after Dr. Mahathir wrote his letter and asked for the Tunku to resign, because Dr. Mahathir had significant support, and when he did that, it was not a single person writing. He had supporters behind him.
But
so
the
there was
chronology,
already that was in
the chronology of events doesn't support that. I think.
he wrote the letter in after May 13.
But much later.
Much
in the
later.
meantime, yeah, much later, and then it led to his dismissal from the party.
How much later? Not years later.
Months later. Months later, yeah.
But in the meantime,
Yeah.
the NOC was already
That's right.
established.
Everything.
Yeah, no, I'm talking about removal of the Tunku.
Oh, okay.
There was already an undercurrent.
Yes.
So, the NOC's steps in the jigsaw, but the undercurrent was there, and then it gained momentum, and that was the push, the thing to remove the Prime Minister, which ultimately happened.
I think your question, Dennis, about is this the beginning of what we have now, which is being termed ketuananism. This ethno-populist movement began, it predates, if you look at it historically, it actually predates, it's part of the whole anti-colonial nationalist, Malay nationalist movement. All right, towards independence, and then after that, when we got our independence, it continued. The system of politics framed around ethnicities, the different ethnicities in Malaysia, is naturally there, because we are a multi-ethnic country. The problem comes when it becomes, when you have supremacists and ethno-nationalists who insist that this country must be governed by the majority race. And we deny the fact that we are a multi-ethnic nation. Because the myth, another myth that has been promoted, is that any multi-ethnic society is bound to fail. It's bound to be imbued with violence. Therefore, you need a strong ethnicity, majority ethnic group to control it. Of course, I disagree with that, because there are many ways to have a marriage of all ethnicities. It has been done. It can be done. It has to have political will. So many countries have done it. So in that sense, I would agree with you that this was the start of the alliance. Actually then morphed into BN, and then now we have what the whole culture of ethno-dominance in the country.
It's interesting, this thing you brought about whether it's planned or whether it was spontaneous. If we look at the way in which May 13 has been used since then, you know, it was although it was, you know, like Syed has said, there were disturbances. This was a most traumatic so-called event, and has been used ever since. Every time there's a hint of opposition, a hint of civil society movement, etc., it is used as a threat.
It's used as a silencing mechanism.
And we have seen it in our lifetime. Yes. Operation Lalang, you know, they're saying
it worked until 2008. 2008, they lost. 2008, they lost a 2/3 majority. Yeah. 2 plus 5, 13, it got worse. 218, they got kicked out. 222, it was a hung parliament lah. Okay, yesterday they won in Air Kuning. So on the ground level, all these things don't work. Even in the Malays, it doesn't work anymore.
It's still being used.
It's being used because they are desperate. These people don't have political capital. But with the voters, especially with the Malay people, it doesn't work anymore. Otherwise, they would not have lost the 2/3 in 2008 and lost power in 2018, 218 and 222. And what do you call this? It's that agenda issue is purely during the Perhimpunan Agong. That's it. Yes. It's not on the street level. People are
exactly.
fed up.
Can I come back to Dr. Ismail? About 2 months after May 13th. Actually a few days after May 13th, gave a speech in which he made this statement: democracy died on May 13th. Of course, people wonder what exactly he meant. But there's also a sense that he was right in the sense that we went from being a nascent, multicultural democracy that was still finding its feet, it was just a few years after our independence, into a race-based, semi-apartheid, semi-authoritarian state. What's your comment about that?
Well, it certainly was, the state of emergency that came up, the suspension of the Sarawak election, state election, there was the death of democracy there. There was no need for the Sarawak elections to be suspended. And the host of, the flurry of policy changes after that, amendment to the Constitution, yes. These are all evidence of that.
In fact, after May 13th, we see a series of repressive laws that you have the University Colleges Act 1971, the Sedition Act 1948 was strengthened, the Emergency Essential Powers Act came in 1979, the the printing and press and publications, and in a sense they were all justified on the grounds that it was needed to prevent another May 13th. So you can see the progression of how we went from being this nascent democracy, and slowly we are shifting more and more after May 13th to a more authoritarian system with more repressive laws, yes. From which we have still not recovered.
Right. We have used that era of violence in our history to perpetuate authoritarian and legislation. So as you mentioned, our coup is still in place. Nobody wants to respond to our recommendations to reform it or to repeal it. We also have clamped down on student activities on campus. Speakers' corners are now being policed, banning of books. I mean, this is becoming...
Bloggers, Facebookers getting arrested, still being charged.
Yes, so, but in terms of education, history, I would say, the only way to be awakened and move back towards this notion of a democracy is to relax or to open up the study of history in schools, and that includes oral history. The number of victims or survivors and who witnessed 1969, they're getting older, and that's why I think you will refer to the book later. We need to stress the fact that we need to revisit how we perceive history and how it is taught. And we need to include the sub-discipline of oral history as well.
I want to return to that, but there's also this thing that
Can I just finish on the democracy thing?
Go ahead. Okay.
Well, democracy has not died, I disagree, but other things have died. Okay, you see, I go back to 2008 because that year, Penang was won by basically DAP and PKR and Selangor. They lost 5 states. And then 2018, they lost the federal elections. So the people who were in opposition for so long, 63 years, who have been basically harping for all these changes, and they are in power now. So democracy works. The DAP, until today, the DAP and the opposition basically control or have a strong influence in 5 states. So there's a good mix-up of at the state level of party politics, who's in power, And federal level is an astonishing power sharing mechanism. You have UMNO and DAP and everybody else together, and so it shows that they are sorting things out. So that's democracy, lah. You have to power at the end of the day. You have to be in power.
Well, can I please interrupt?
So they make deals with each other. But the thing is, as you mentioned just now, Munirah, all the changes have happened. Who is in power now? DAP has got 40 seats in parliament, but there's no changes.
No,
nothing has changed.
That's
in the last,
why I need to interrupt.
How many? 60 years, 50 years.
So could that be because of the system that evolved after May 13th?
So democracy is alive. You go to yesterday, Ayah Kuning, they won. Democracy is alive, but nothing else has changed.
I'm sorry.
I read your articles. His articles. He's getting more and more exasperated. It's true. Nothing has changed.
Democracy is alive, but nothing has changed because we don't have the ideal democracy, which is we don't have local council elections. Okay, this is a very important aspect of democracy that hasn't changed.
Okay, we're talking about democracy, and then you talk about authoritarianism after May 13. But the main thesis of my book wasn't just that it was planned and it was a coup d'etat, but the coup d'etat by whom? Yes. That has changed. That has changed very much. It was I said that the May 13 was orchestrated by this emergent state capitalist class in Malaysia, and that has changed fundamentally. They came into power, overthrew the Tunku, and then from there they entrenched their power, and only when Mahathir came in with his privatization policies, divested the state capital to all these private Malay capital. That is the most fundamental change in Malaysian society today. So you can have your DAP and your PH and whoever it is, that new class in control is what's important. And of course they rule with non-Bumiputra capital as well.
They have taken over.
That's right, they are the ones who have taken over.
But they are using the ethnic...
That is the fundamental change that we should see, not just who wins an election.
Yes, the fundamental change, correct. But the old way of using race and ethnicity
is still there. The temple issue?
Yes, but it is a...
May 13 was mentioned in the temple issue,
But the issue is a class issue rather than a racial ethnic issue.
Okay, it has been said that May 13th shattered what remained of the trust between ethnic communities, and that it did so much damage that we are still to recover that kind of trust between ethnicities. Do you agree or disagree?
The trust for me is now that we do not, the majority of Malaysians do not trust politics and politicians.
Not each other.
We don't.
At the street level, people are okay.
Yes, it is not a matter of...
People go about their business in Malaysia.
Yes, we do not, and no matter which political party comes into power, we still have that mistrust.
So you're saying that May 13th didn't destroy the trust between communities, but destroyed the trust between the community and the politicians?
Yes.
Because there are no lingering issues. You see, if I may, just a couple of minutes, you see like now in Pakistan, they have this Balochistan fight going on, That thing started more than 80 years ago. It's the Baloch people, totally, they don't accept Pakistani state or the Punjabi people. Northern Ireland, they made the peace treaty in 1998, the Good Friday Agreement. It hasn't really helped because the underlying issues have not been fully resolved. There's still violence going on, but on a much smaller scale in Northern Ireland today. Scotland, they had that independence referendum in a few years back, isn't it? About 2014. They lost by a small margin, and now the independence movement in Scotland, they are aiming to have another referendum. If they swing by 5–6%, they still become independent because they have not solved this underlying unhappiness in Balochistan, in Scotland, in Ireland, I think also somewhere in Spain. These issues are, and the northeast part of India, that is a major problem. So the underlying issues, the unhappiness, the hatreds or whatever, they have not overcome it. We don't have that here. Within a few months of things that you mentioned, people went about their business. Now, 56 years have gone by.
But yet you see all these simmering tensions when the slightest spark and people come out on the streets.
No, but we can't talk in the abstract. First of all, I'm considered a non-Bumiputra. Where did this concept of the Bumiputra come in? Is it in the Constitution? It is not. Okay. So we're talking about trust and all that kind of stuff. This is a fundamental change. And then when the concept of Ketuanan Melayu was regularized by Abdullah Ahmad in 1986, this new concept suddenly became part of the parlance in the newspapers, you know, Ketuanan Melayu. And then, you know, Operation Lalang, you know, is used as part of the national life. So when you talk about trust, these are new concepts that are coming in. And how do people trust? They vote with their feet. You know, the number of people who migrated in the 80s was 1 million. I believe it's now nearly 2 million. So when you talk about trust, what trust are we talking about?
No, but they lost the elections in 2018. 7 years have gone by. Why is it still here? Why is Ketuanan still around? They're no more in power. Please explain.
No, the concept is still there.
Because the concept remains
valid.
Is still there. It doesn't matter.
How do people have trust?
I hold a view.
I'm just saying, how do people have trust?
I hold a view that it doesn't matter which
vote
party is in power. They all subscribe. They all subscribe.
Democracy gives you the option to choose your future. They've the things that we didn't like were lost at the polls in 2018, but everything else remains the same. Something's not right.
I think I would like to take off this and move to this issue of trust. It's how religion is interpreted and how the interpretation of Islam is drummed into ordinary Muslim Malaysians about what is haram and what is halal. The trust issue, I would say, you know, we are not visiting each other's homes anymore. We are not eating and having, you know, celebratory meals together, because it is constantly influencers on the internet. They are constantly telling us that you have to check if the glasses are haram or halal. You know, if you can eat with the utensils. I mean, these are the ridiculous issues that are being drummed into Muslim minds.
The Muslims.
So it goes back to education. And the whole reason why it is a sensitive topic to talk about religious education in schools is because whatever political administration is there in power, they need to control this narrative to remain in power. So I would say that it is a very complicated matter, this issue of trust.
Yes, but the question of how this has come into the Malay agenda after May 13th. You know, that's the important thing.
Well, it has a life. It's taken on a life of its own,
right.
Because to remain in power.
You've not mentioned the new economic policy. That is the
crucial one.
Crucial
one, yes.
That one was a spark that caused a lot of abuse. A lot of things just branched off from there and went
and the NEP was also a product of May 13th.
Yes, it was.
It was.
And the NEP serves the purpose of the so-called state capitalist class.
So May 13th fundamentally altered the dynamics of the nation, didn't it?
It was an affirmative action policy with good intentions, but the intentions all disappeared out the window in a very short time. And a lot of things that are wrong now have branched off from there. The way they've abused the affirmative action. Yeah. If they had stuck to it, done it properly. You see, you want to help affirmative action, okay, fine, you help one group, but not by putting up obstacles for other people. That is negative, or that's not good really, which is what has become the policy now. Not only do we have positive discrimination, at the same time we have negative discrimination. Yeah. If you drop the negative discrimination, it is fine. But it's just the negative discrimination now is like, it's been there for a long time. Like, that's what we need to change.
I want to now talk about the historical aspects of it. This book, Life After Oral Histories of the May 13th, which again I highly recommend for all Malaysians to read. Reading this book gives you an insight into the tremendous anguish that the families of the victims still carry even today. For them, the wounds never healed. There's no closure. There's stories here about mothers, every time a taxi comes up today, still expect their son or their daughter to turn up. So it's left a gaping wound. And then you look at the fact that the emergency ordinance on the 16th of May actually gave the police the right to dispose of the bodies any way they saw fit, so long as they recorded it. That was the emergency ordinance that was issued on the 16th of May. And if you look at the whole way the bodies were rather unceremoniously buried in a corner of a leper colony and really forgotten. It was like nobody wanted to even think about it, talk about it. It became taboo. You don't even discuss how many died or how they died or where they were buried or who the victims were. And so and then there's the question of, I think, we talked earlier about the number of victims, and others feel, in one of your articles said that it could be, scholars estimate it could be 800, 1,000. Where were the rest of the bodies? So I want to look, to ask about the victims of this. Do we as a nation owe it to them to provide a full accounting of how their loved ones died? There's been talk about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, talk about building a memorial. So what are your views? You've obviously talked a lot to some of the victims. You attended the May 13th memorial. So what's your thinking about this?
Well, if I may, from a religious point of view, perspective, given that we are supposedly a country, a nation based on Islamic values, I would say it is the Islamic ethical, moral thing to do to recognize what has happened, and we owe it to the survivors and the victims' families to recognize, to create a memorial and to recognize it every year, to respect them for the lives that they've lost. By silencing, by ignoring what has happened, it is counterproductive. It is the wrong thing to do. It is not the religious way to operate. And I have more to say about it, but yeah. Please proceed.
We know there were more than the official figure of 196 deaths. Yeah. But if you just take the government's figure at its face value, and you go to Sungai Buloh, the mass graves there, you can see that there are something like 100 to 108 tombstones there, and some of them are very unceremoniously written, unidentified. So if there's 100 to 108 there, what has happened to the rest? We know, we heard that there are some in Gombak. I don't know where in Gombak it is. You think that kind of information will be known in the 21st century, Yeah. And then for another thing, let's look at Wang Kelien. In 2019, mass graves were discovered of foreign migrants or whatever, the trafficked people. And they were exhumed, identified, and cause of death was there. I don't see why we can't do that for the people who are buried at Sungai Buloh, But I'm positive that it's actually a mass grave. It's not true that they're singular people buried there. So these are things that should be done. And if you look at, Qingming has just gone by. I usually go back every year to visit my ancestors' graves. In every Chinese cemetery in the country, there will be a monument to those who died in the anti-Japanese resistance. A monument, because so many of them. And there's no reason why we can't honor the victims of May 13 with a monument. Yeah. It's the least we can do,
You also talked about reparations. You also talked about acknowledging.
Reparations is more is up to the family. It's not for me anyway.
Right. I think go ahead.
I think like 20 years ago, this podcast would not have been allowed to discuss May 13. Now 56 years have gone by. It's a lot of time. Maybe closure. We need closure, and we have DNAs and all these other kinds of forensic technology.
You think we need to have that, provide them with that closure?
If you want, memorial. We have that.
What about reconciliation? What about truth and reconciliation?
I think that's important, yeah.
It's very important, but it also means that the official data has to be also released. Now, until that happens, I doubt there will be...
Why have successive governments, including this reformist government, been so reluctant to do that?
Because this so-called reformist government has still got UMNO in it. You know, the people who are part of the whole establishment are still there, and some of the new reformers were former UMNO leaders as well. So they may be reluctant to do that, and that is.
Yeah, it's actually partly to do with you know, the UMNO being in part of the current government, but it also has to do with how Malaysians or modern Malaysians today perceive their identity. You see, this issue of this trend towards right-wing populism, it's not just happening in Malaysia. It's globally. It's happening globally. So we've got to nip this trend in the bud. We've not got enough of a movement to influence education in this term. So in this aspect. So I'm very cynical about whether it is going to happen.
That's right. But it can happen. It happened in South Africa.
It can.
It happened in Rwanda.
Because of political will.
That's
exactly. Right. And we need a new generation of politicians. But, you know, as I have seen, as we have all seen after 2018, we had some young politicians coming on board into the PH 1.0 government, but very disappointing performance as well.
So, one final question. Are we as a nation ready to have this discussion? What happened? Who were the victims? What went wrong? Are we ready as a nation? Because you still hear so much talk about, oh, you know, we have to, even just recently the Prime Minister issued a warning that, you know, we must not touch on sensitive issues, we don't want to open old wounds and all that. So it seems to me, reading all this, that we as a nation, we're not ready to have this conversation.
We are ready.
We need it, but we're not ready for it.
We are ready insofar as we pick and choose our words and our body language.
It's how you
and
say it.
It's how you say it, because
it's how you approach the subject.
Using the internet, TikTok, Instagram, you have a whole different culture out there which is inflammatory. They're saying the same things.
That's the word. If it's not inflammatory, if it's
we are definitely ready.
Genuinely seeking, you can come to conclusion.
You need a political coalition. Like, look at 2018. In 2018, both coalitions, you know, both coalitions were promising so many things. You know, they were promising to recognize the unified examination certificate by the Chinese. They promised this and that. You know, they were going to pull back AUKU and all this kind of stuff. Very simple things, you know, that they can do. And they failed to do it when they came into power.
But I must correct you there. As far as AUKU goes, Masli was on the way towards doing it. But
he didn't get there.
He didn't get there because the Sheraton move happened. Okay, and I can safely say the academic movement was involved in that. So we knew that it was going to happen. But of course, you know, things happened.
The most shocking thing is that after 2018, I think when Mahathir was Prime Minister, and they were talking about ratifying the ICARD, the International Convention on Eradication of Racial Discrimination, they said some groups came out and said, well, there will be May 13 if you ratify. Yes. So that's shocking, you know. Yes. That's really shocking, because ratification of the ICARD, most countries in the world have done that.
So are you hopeful that we will come to the point where we can have this discussion politely, sanely, rationally, that we can have national reconciliation, that we can have a memorial, because that's what
I feel if we keep breaking up the politics, if the people keep voting for different parties, nobody gets a big majority, these changes will happen. It's a question of time. Democracy does work, and we have to, discussions like this have to gain a momentum, and then it might bring some changes. You know. It's
Final thoughts?
It's who we put in power.
Final thoughts?
No, I think that closure is very important.
Yes.
And like I said, after 55 years, you know, in most countries, 30 years is when the official secrets are declassified. In this country, there's no reason why after 55 years we can't do that.
Let's put it this way. I myself am hopeful because life after the book was not banned. Your book was not banned. It was almost banned, but you know, the late.
My book is banned.
Okay, but we're talking about little victories along the way. So that gives me hope. I'm not going to be, you know, terribly cynical, but at the same time, I'm also not naive and so optimistic. But I do look at the little victories, and the fact that we are able to have this.
Yes. We shouldn't wait for the politicians. It's we on the ground, the people, the society. We should start talking.
And we
forget about the politicians. They are always there to use and abuse.
And politicians,
and, you know,
the ones we have now, are older. They're going to die off, whether we like it or not. This is part of being human, right?
But the agenda is very important. You know,
yes.
Every time elections come, the people must demand certain
exactly.
things. That's what elections are about.
And I'm optimistic that society is becoming a bit more mature. As every day goes by, we are maturing. So it may not happen in our lifetime, but I need the people listening in to.
We have to keep hoping for that.
To have that optimism.
Yeah.
Well, with that, Munirah, Soong, Syed, thank you very much for coming on Straight Talk.